Merci, Dominic. Thank you for inviting me to this conference, which that I much appreciate so far. My presentation. Thanks for inviting me to make that presentation, write that paper and sorry for sending it so late this week to you both. My presentation will overlap a bit with what's been said already. But I think there are complementary presentations, so I look forward to the Q&A where we can engage with all three of us on the questions. So basically, I start with the context of the prospects for peace in Ukraine, with the two most opposite positions that we can see right now on the debate. There's a vivid debate in the press and among political actors, of course, and in the media. Between those that suggest that an off-ramp should be proposed to Russia through peace negotiations and accommodation. And it's not on the slide that you see, but I just read this morning a piece in Foreign Policy by Levit and Brukovich that argue the same, and I'll quote them on this because you can't see it. Forcing a cornered nuclear-armed state led by a man who sees his misguided war as an existential struggle into a complete and humiliating retreat poses far greater risks than the benefits of trying to recapture every square mile of Ukrainian territory occupied by Russian forces. A negotiated ceasefire with strong enforcement is the best option, end of quotation. So this is what you see, of course, on one side of the debate. The other side is that the only way out of this war is through a total Russian military defeat and regime change in Moscow. This is what President Zelensky said. This is what President Biden said before correcting himself, or his staff corrected him later, saying this is not what he meant. He's very used to gaffes, it seems, both on Taiwan and on Ukraine, the US president. And lately, and despite his remarks about not humiliating Russia, President Macron also said that for his perspective, and just like the G7 as well, Leaders Summit agreed on, that the objective of France and of other Western powers is the return to the borders of 1991. So the question is, who's right, the doves or the hawks? I think a very similar path as you both, Tim and Sam, on your paper on how to answer this, but I add to the theory of how wars end as well some literature on the cause of the war, the current war in Ukraine. And the argument I make at the end, and I conclude with this, is that the best chance for a lasting peace is through the defeat of the Russian invasion and restoration of the deterrence. So to get there, let's look at the first cause of the war, what many scholars call Putin's neo-colonial view of Ukraine as a phony and illegitimate state, which is driven in great part on something that is significant in Russian nationalism, the resentment or the sense of humiliation which drive its revanchism, I'm not sure how to say it in English, the revanchism in its status-seeking foreign policy. This has been written on Russia prior to the war, prior to the 2014, something that in the early 2000s as well was very present in trying to understand and make sense of Putin's foreign policy. And on that ground, I argue that because of this revanchism, it inhibits a compromise over new colonial war aims, which very restricts the possibility for President Putin to moderate his own war aims without putting his own survival in jeopardy, and which very much limits, and I agree with you both, the possibility of a peaceful settlement in this objective, because it's not merely to prevent Ukraine from joining EU or NATO, because that was proposed in the March tentative agreement that in Istanbul that you referred to in the early presentation, but there's more to that. It's the desire to control the Ukrainian state, which could have been done if the Russian military had focused its invasion on the Donbass region only and had imposed a fait accompli in the very early days of the war before the West could have provided military weapons and sophisticated weapons to Ukraine. But they chose not to do that very stupidly from their own point of view, and we're in the situation we are now today because of this. The second cause of war that I add to the earlier presentation is the failure of deterrence. I argue that there's been a green lightening of Russia's invasion by the unwillingness of the United States, but also of the rest of NATO, to intervene or to provide, prior to the war, the means for Ukraine to defend itself enough to deter further invasion in 2022. Because of that, the lack of any moral or legal or political obligation to defend Ukraine, the of course, the underestimation of the Ukraine military's willingness to resist, misjudgment on Russia's military capability to accomplish its military aims. There was this sense that this was not of significant importance for the United States work deploying troops or providing the weapons needed. And as Corey Sheikh argued recently, that this actually allowed or permitted that invasion because there was no significant military cost in President Putin's point of view of intervening, given his own very underestimation as well of Ukraine's capability and willingness to resist, and a very high view of what he could do with 100,000 troops in such a long front line of war. So I believe that had deterrence been strengthened before the invasion, that could have prevented it, whether through a strategic ambiguity position from the United States, whether by pledging to provide sophisticated weapons, defensive or offensive, prior to the war. I think this would have prepared the West for what the current situation we're in, where we lack ammunition to provide to the Ukrainian military in a protracted war that will be very important, and as well also help to create the conditions favorable to the invasion. So, moving on to how wars end, I mostly rely on Dan Rader's book and the theory of bargaining model to assess when, why, and how belligerents agree to end wars. And of course, I agree with the literature that's been said before, that basically wars end when one party is militarily forced to concede, or when a third party enforces or compels warring parties to abide by a peace agreement. I also agree that total military victory is highly unlikely, defined as regime change as perpetrated by President Zelensky in his own war aims publicly. I don't believe that neither parties have the military capability to force total victory on the other, and that because even if the Ukraine military were to succeed in restoring the 1991 borders, that would still, the threat posed by the Russian military would still remain, and unless there would be a change in the war aims from Russia's point of view, that would be still a threat, and there would still be military incursions, I believe. And so I don't believe that total military on either side is likely if you define it as really total, absolute military victory. I also believe that there's no credible commitments to peace short of a total military victory. Neither Moscow would be credible to pledge the respect of Ukraine's territorial integrity, as it has shown for the last 8 years, and neither would Kyiv be credible to pledge that it would not seek closer ties to the West, because this is a strong desire, and it's a key for its own survival in the future after an armistice or a peace settlement. So, victory or peace short of total victory would mean is possible in two circumstances: when the cost of continuing to fight promise to escalate significantly and become prohibitive, therefore you make compromise. You compromise on your war aims. This is exactly what Putin is trying to do by threatening the use of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, but it's very likely, given the reaction of the United States and of the even EU High Representative lately, with the severe consequences and the direct intervention of the United States in these circumstances, that this will hopefully deter from such use of nuclear weapons. The second way that you can achieve peace short of total victory is when a third party enforces a peace deal. And that would be key for any peace settlement or armistice. Now, there are two most plausible ways, through a UN or NATO or Western intervention. The UN, I think, likeliness is very low, of course, given the veto, but also because that would freeze the front line in a way that neither party would be comfortable with, I believe. And so I argue that the best way for a lasting peace from Ukraine's point of view would be from a Western military presence guarding the inviolability of its own borders. Therefore, we're stuck in a suboptimal situation where President Putin is cornered, has to face a choice between nuclear escalation, prolonging the war indefinitely, or a permanent Western military presence in Ukraine, which is obviously contrary to his interest. And so to conclude, the plausible paths towards peace are either a substantial revision of Russia's neocolonial war aims or an intervention of third party capable of imposing prohibitive costs on Russia. I do hope that it's the first that happens, but I believe that the most likely scenario is the restoration of deterrence in Ukraine. Thank you.